Hello, everyone, and thank you very much indeed for enabling me to join you via video for this conference. I would have loved to have been there in person. Unfortunately, the timings haven't worked out for me. And it's been a real pleasure engaging with all of you throughout the course of this project in relation to the stakeholder analysis. And it's really great to be starting to see some of the results now feeding through from the great work that you guys are doing on the ground. Now in this talk, I'm going to touch on this project and talk a little bit about how stakeholder analysis has been done in this research and why. But I also want to think more broadly about stakeholder analysis as a tool, because for me this is an incredibly flexible and adaptable tool that you should be able to use not only in this project but in many other projects that you are doing if they involve working with stakeholders. So what is stakeholder analysis? For me, this is a process that enables you to identify who has a stake in your research, so you know who to work with. It helps you then to categorize and prioritize stakeholders so that you can strategically invest your time and energy effectively with the people that can most help you to achieve the outcomes you want. And it helps identify and prepare you for relationships between stakeholders. Some of these may be alliances, which can be useful for you, but also there may be conflicts which you need to be aware of so that you avoid inflaming those conflicts. Now, for me, this is important for a number of reasons. And primarily, this is about ensuring that you're talking to the right people so that your work has legitimacy and so that you can get a sense of shared ownership and start working together. You're not just working with the usual suspects, the people who always come along to everything, but you're also able now to systematically think about who might be typically marginalized and forgotten about so that you can engage them in the process as well. And you now have a sense of what it is that interests different groups so that you can approach those different groups in different ways to engage with their motives and make them feel valued and interested in collaborating with you. And you have a sense also of who is the most influential within this context and who can really facilitate or block you from achieving what you want, so you can engage with them early and get their help rather than actually having problems with them later on in the process. Now, the traditional way of doing stakeholder analysis is to create a matrix that looks something like this, where you plot the influence of a stakeholder group or organization against its interest. Now, I think what is useful about this is the way that it categorizes different types of stakeholders and the different ways in which you therefore need to engage with these different groups. So, for example, you get the key players who are really interested in what you're doing, but also highly influential, who clearly you need to engage with if you want to be successful. But there may also be subjects out there who have a huge interest in what you're doing, but who have fairly limited influence. Now, this may be a group who is going to be significantly disadvantaged by your work, who really care about that. They're really interested in your work because it's going to rob them of a livelihood. But they have very little influence, and you don't want to use that as an excuse for marginalizing them. Actually, you want to identify the fact that these are really important groups to engage with, and you're going to engage with them in a very specific way to try and ameliorate some of those concerns and help this to be hugely a win-win for them. Now, the context setters are probably the most challenging group. These are guys who are not that interested in what you're doing, but hugely influential, whether that's influential in facilitating your work or blocking it. Now, there are a number of reasons why they may not be interested in your work. Very often, it's just simply that your work is a bit too narrow or a bit too kind of on the edge of their desk. And so if you want to engage with them, and it often will be really crucial that you do engage with them, then you need to think of ways that you can bring your project back into the center of their vision, right into the center of their desk, so that they care about it, they're interested enough to engage with you, and therefore to help you rather than block you. Now, When I've used this tool with stakeholders, I think the problem for me is that much of the most interesting conversation goes on around where people are moving people in this matrix. So this organization is really influential for this reason. No, they're not. I disagree for that reason. And all that discussion is actually where the richness is and where the most useful information often lies. And for that reason, I use an extendable matrix, which has been adapted for the purpose of this project to enable you to think in a really systematic way about who might have an interest in water security action planning and water management more generally, and what influence they might hold in ways that will be of clear benefit to this project and that can inform your action and your work with those stakeholders. Now, it'll be interesting to hear how this process went for you on the ground. I'm sure not all of it will have gone according to plan, and inevitably you will have had to adapt this to an extent. But the basic ingredients to this approach are having a workshop where you invite a small number of cross-cutting stakeholders who have a sense of the overall stakeholder landscape and know what might interest these people, to then work with them, ideally, rather than just your own team, to think about who these people are. And basically, we're now working through each of the columns of this extendable matrix to identify who has a stake in your work. Now, the first thing that you're looking at is to identify the name of that organization. It may be a team or department within that organization. It may, in fact, be a group such as farmers or a type of farmer. Whatever it is, you're trying to then now rate the interest that they have. Don't spend too long on this because it is fairly subjective, but it will help flag up where you might have some problems. And then more importantly, we're trying to characterize exactly what is it that group is likely to be interested in relation to this project. Very often you'll find that different groups have radically different interests in our work, and therefore we will need to engage with them quite differently if we want to work effectively with them. Now, the fourth column here asks to identify where there are stakeholders that have low levels of interest and current engagement with our work, that we may want to engage more with our work. Now, these guys become particularly important where they are very influential, which we're going to be able to identify later on in the matrix. So if they're not engaged at the moment and they're important, why are they not engaged, and what might we be able to do in terms of their interests that might be able to get them involved so that they can facilitate our work. In this project, we've adapted this matrix quite significantly. And of course, one of the great things about this as a tool is you can adapt this as long as you've got influence and interest and you're rating that in some way and characterizing that. These other columns can be changed. Of course, bear in mind, the more columns, the longer it takes to do the work. So in this project, we've asked people about their level of knowledge about water-related issues. So is this a very knowledgeable group or organization or not? And what is their access to high-quality information about water-related issues? And then finally, we're looking at their level of influence and the nature of influence on water management planning. And finally, there's a column on relationships, and this is one that I usually leave blank and just tackle at the end of the workshop, where I'm identifying whether there are particular groups that have alliances or that are in conflict with one another that we need to really think about. Now, that gives you a fairly good overview. The next step is to start trying to categorize. Are there particular kind of groupings? So in terms of the ways in which people use water, for example, I would always try and think of a kind of a functional way of classifying stakeholders, but there is no right answer to this. And then if we want to make sure that this is a really robust analysis, we're going to want to check whether this actually works with some other people. Of course, the results that you have in this matrix now are going to be influenced by the people who you invited to help you with that analysis. So I'm now identifying maybe 4 or 5 key individuals from each of those key categories of stakeholders that we've identified. And I'm going and interviewing them, getting them on side, understanding what their interests are, giving them a sense of co-ownership of the work early on, because we've identified they are important to engage with early on. And I'm asking them, well, what do you think? Does this make sense to you? Would you add different groups? Is there anyone important that we've forgotten about? And at this point, it becomes a bit iterative, and you're feeding this back to your original group and asking them what they think, until eventually you go back and forth and you arrive at an analysis that everyone feels is robust and represents the real stakeholder community that is out there. What you then have is a highly robust, systematic, and for me really powerful analysis of who has an interest and why, that can empower you to go out there and form the relationships you need, the alliances you need, and to work collaboratively with stakeholders to achieve shared goals. Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk today. Obviously, I can't be involved in the discussion because this is a recorded video, but I'd be really interested to hear how the discussion goes, and in particular to compare your experience on the ground using this tool in the Middle Eastern context with what I'm telling you from theory and from my own practice seems to work. Did it work or didn't it? Which were the bits that worked best? Which bits did you have to adapt? And what can you collectively learn from each other from that experience? Enjoy the discussion, and thanks very much.